So one thing that has come to my attention in one of my earlier videos, I had a conversation with a viewer, and essentially we talked about the fate of Homoda, like what could potentially happen to her in the fourth movie. One thing that I brought up is the fact that Homoda could potentially die should the Madoka Magica series continue. Now, I actually had this conversation with two people, and they both essentially said the same thing, just in different ways. They said that Homoda dying was impossible because of the fact that she was the main character of the series, and her the fan base of Madoka Magica, or at least a good portion of them, are really connected to her. So the last thing that the series would do would be to kill her off for those reasons. Now, I thought about this, and one conclusion that I came to is that, in all honesty, Homelander dying within the next movie would make perfect sense. And let me explain why. First and foremost, if you're watching this video and you're unaware, the person who writes the story for Madoka Magica, meaning the person who wrote the story for the original anime, as well as the movie Rebellion, is an author that goes by the name of Gen Urobuchi. Now, if you're someone who is familiar with his work, then you would know that Gen Urobuchi tends to write really dark stories. Like, aside from Madoka Magica, he's also done Fate Zero, he's also done Psycho Pass, and the list goes on. He actually has quite the interesting resume, but one thing about Gen Urobuchi's stories is that he tends to write stories that are really dark, and at the same time, these stories tend to have characters die within them. Now, I know from studying Gen Urobuchi and some of his work that he likes to kill off characters within his story, but he likes to do so while conveying a certain type of message to his audience. Now, if I had to give an example, since all of us are Madoka Magica fans, if you think about Sayaka, in the original anime, we all know that Sayaka died in episode 8 when she transformed into a witch. Now, if you think about Sayaka's character and her role within the series up to her dying, she served a very interesting purpose when you think about it. It's like she served as a deconstruction. It's like we saw her at the beginning as this really cheerful girl with, these ambitions to want to protect people, wanting to help the love of her life, and essentially just wanting to do the right thing. And then we slowly see her deconstruct from this way of thinking due to all the events that happened surrounding Cubane and the Soul Gems. And before we knew it, she was on this path of despair. She no longer wanted to protect people. She lost confidence in herself. And as a result, she ultimately died. Now, again, Sayaka, depending on who you are, Sayaka's role and death within the series has a different meaning. Like, if I had to talk about what Sayaka meant for me, I always felt like Sayaka was the most relatable character in Madoka Magica because she wasn't perfect and her flaws were very easy to see compared to somebody like Mami or Kyoko. Like, these were two characters who were very strong, at least the way that they were portrayed. Like, you had Mami, who was a veteran magical girl, and despite the fact that she lost her family at a young age, she trained herself until she became an experienced magical girl who everybody else within the series ultimately looks up to. If you think about Kyoko, Kyoko went through one hell of a tragedy, losing her family as a result of her wish to try to help her father. But despite that, she was able to not allow herself to fall into despair and became a veteran magical girl very similar to Mami. And of course, we know that, Kyoko is actually a very strong character. So that's what separates Mami and Kyoko from Sayaka. Sayaka, in a lot of ways, lacked all the things that both Mami and Kyoko had. But I feel like because of the fact that Sayaka was an imperfect character, at least she was imperfect in a way that it was more obvious, because truth be told, all the girls in the series have aspects to them that make them all imperfect, but Sayaka was the most obvious in my opinion. And as a result, it's really easy to relate to Sayaka for me. So what I'm trying to say is that Sayaka's role within the series, especially her death, had a meaning to it. Now, I'm sure if I were to ask everybody listening to this video what your interpretation of Sayaka's character was and what her death meant, I'm sure all of you have your own perceptions and feelings regarding what Sayaka's role and death meant to you. But the bottom line is that Sayaka's role within the series leading up to her death had a purpose. And the same thing can be said for Kyoko. Kyoko's death had a purpose as well. When you consider the connection she had with Sayaka and the way that she ultimately died trying to help Sayaka. Kyoko dying had a meaning to it. Now, the same thing can be said for Mami in episode 3. Obviously, she was portrayed at the beginning as a veteran magical girl who was very lonely, didn't have a lot of friends. And in episode 3, she died, but you have to understand that Mami's death, just like Kyoko and Sayaka, served a purpose. Now, I say all this to say that Homura dying within the fourth movie is something that is very realistic. And the reason being is that just like how in the original anime, when characters died, the reason that they died was to convey a certain type of message, which is what Gen Urobuchi is known for in his stories. So Homura dying is something that could happen for two reasons. First and foremost, if there was a message that Gen Urobuchi was trying to convey to his audience through Homura's death, like something meaningful, something that could, impact us, then I see no reason why he wouldn't do it. If that was his vision, if he had something he was really trying to say to us, just like as he was trying to say through Sayaka and Kyoko and even Mami. So I believe that's one reason that Homura could die in the next movie. Another reason why I think Homura could die in the next movie is because what you need to understand is that Madoka Magica is a series that never ever has a happy ending. Like if you're somebody who's ever read the spin-off manga, like for example, if you've I'm not going to spoil anything, but if you've read something like Different Story, then you know that that manga does not have a happy ending. And if you've read any of the other spin-off mangas, then you know that these mangas never ever have happy endings. In fact, what usually ends up happening is the thing that you would least expect happens, and there's always a twist that you didn't see coming. So it's usually a twist as well as, as an ending that is not a happy one. So truth be told, the one thing that fans of Madoka Magica would never expect would be for Homura to die. And that is precisely why it could happen, because nobody would see it coming. It would be a complete twist, just like how nobody saw it coming that Homura was going to do what she did by the end of the third movie. Just like how nobody who watched the original Madoka Magica anime could predict that Madoka would become a goddess at the very end of the series and make the type of wish that she did, which would result in the world changing the way that it did. None of us were able to predict those two outcomes. And I can guarantee that none of us will be able to predict how the fourth movie will end should the fourth movie come into existence, because that is just the nature of Madoka Magica. This is a series that we're not supposed to be able to predict. We're not supposed to predict it, and no matter what, we're going to have an outcome that's more than likely not going to be a happy ending. So that's essentially it. This is kind of me rambling a little bit here. But the bottom line is that I'm not saying that Homura is going to die, but I do think, based on what I mentioned before about Gen Urobuchi and the type of writer that he is, meaning that, as I said, he's the type of person who writes stories where he tends to want to kill off characters because he has a certain meaning or some type of message he wants to convey. Because of the fact that he is this type of writer, and because of the fact that Madoka Magica is a series that is known for giving you what you would least expect, There is a very likely possibility, not saying this is a for sure thing, but there is a possibility that Homina could in fact die. That's just the bottom line. It could happen just based on everything that I just said.